Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we're covering part 2 of my complete tier list of every armor item in Baldur's Gate 3. In part 1, I covered robes and clothing, so every piece of armor that doesn't require a proficiency to use, and now in part 2, we're going to cover light armor. By default, light armor is available to rogues, bards, and warlocks, as well as every class that has heavier armor proficiencies, and also a number of races in Baldur's Gate 3, including humans and half-elves, get light armor proficiency by default. In fact, 6 of the 10 companions in Baldur's Gate 3 have access to light armor inherently, so no matter what class you spec them as, if you're using the companion characters in your party, you're going to be able to use light armor on a large proportion of your party, so this will almost always be available to at least one and probably multiple characters in your party. No matter what composition you go for, it will be one of the most widely available armor types and therefore one of the most commonly used. Just as with the cloth armors, I've divided the light armors by act, although since some of these are available based on your character level rather than at specific locations in the game, I've roughly speaking said that armors available from levels 1 to 5 are in Act 1, armors available from levels 6 to 8 are in Act 2, and armors available at 9+ are Act 3 armors. Obviously that's going to vary depending on how much content you do in each act and what order you do things in and so on, but just as a rough rule of thumb for when you're going to get these armor. That's relevant because we're going to be rating these armors based on the quality at the point where you get them. So how good is this armor when you actually have access to it, rather than sort of its absolute power level over the course of the game. That means that as I go through, armors to the right within a tier will, on average, be stronger than armors further to the left because they're available later in the game. But what matters is when you pick up this armor, is it worth keeping, is it worth putting on, or should you just sell it to a merchant? In S tier, I've placed armors that are best in slot for either a very powerful build or a wide array of builds. In A tier, armors that are best in slot for narrow builds or solid alternatives to S tier armor. B tier armors have the occasional use, but typically are going to see play only in sort of niche or narrow circumstances. C tier maybe have something going for them, but usually aren't going to see any play. And D tier armors are very rarely going to actually be equipped, unless you're doing something specific or just like how they look. Alright, let's get to rating armor. We're going to start with padded armor. Now, I'm using this as a stand-in for all of the 11 armor class non-magical armors available in Baldur's Gate 3, of which there's a million different ones, but they all have the same mechanical effect. So this is padded armor, leather armor, jerkins, all of the unique padded and leather armors available from companions, selenite robes, various different kinds of armor, all of which have 11 base armor class and no magical effect, so they all work out exactly the same in-game. I will say it's a little weird that the game treats all of those kinds of armor as equivalent. In particular, padded and leather armors historically occupied very different roles and niches on the battlefield. Maybe someday I'll do a video on the historical accuracy or inaccuracy in Baldur's Gate armors, but from a mechanical standpoint, the game treats all of these as identical. These give you your full dexterity bonus, but only 11 base AC, so you're going to have very low armor. And while I did say that S tier in this tier list occupies best in slot when you pick it up, so which is technically true for these armors, since you often start with them in your inventory, at which point they are technically best in slot. Obviously, you're never going to pick up and equip these armors on purpose most of the time. You're simply wearing them until you can swap to something better. However, there is one use case for the 11 AC armors, and that is if you are playing a character like a wizard or sorcerer who starts in robes rather than an armor, but nevertheless have light armor proficiency because you're playing a race that gets it, like human or half-elf, you may want to keep an eye out for a padded or leather armor, because that may be the first piece of armor you get that allows you to upgrade your armor class from 10 to 11. That's not an enormous bonus, but every little bit counts in the early game, so I'm going to place these armors in C tier specifically for characters that start in robes and can upgrade their armor class by 1 in the very early game. Next up, studded leather. So, I know I said I would save historical accuracy for a different video, but whenever studded leather comes up, I do have to mention this. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a mini rant, because studded leather is sort of a blight on fantasy games that's existed since the 1970s. Unfortunately, it's so baked in now that we're stuck with it. Studded leather armor is not, and never was, a real type of armor that someone would actually wear, and if you think about it for even a second, then you'll understand why. In order to put metal studs into a piece of cloth, what you would have to do, or a textile, what you would have to do is punch a lot of holes into it in a row. What do you call a bunch of holes punched into something in a row? Perforation, like on a sheet of stamps, which is designed to make it easy to tear along that line. What do you not want your armor to do easily? Tear. So putting a whole bunch of holes in to put these little metal studs that offer no actual protective value to the armor would be extremely counterproductive if you were trying to design something to actually keep you alive in combat. Secondly, leather armor, historically, was not soft like a textile, but actually was very, very stiff and hard. Heat-treated or boiled leather, is very stiff and very strong and very hard. You will get a better sense of what it is actually like if you picture like a heavy piece of plastic, like you might see in police riot armor, rather than if you picture a leather jacket like you might wear out to the club. It's designed that way and treated that way because it's designed to make a blow from an enemy glance off to your side, redirecting the force away from you and into the air, because you don't care if the air gets hurt, but you do care if you get hurt. If you put a bunch of studs on it, that's going to catch any bladed or blunt weapon that's swung into you, that's sliding off to the side of your body, is going to catch on those little studs, redirecting the force directly into you, and again, counteracting exactly what the armor is trying to do, making those studs hurt you much more than if they weren't there. So obviously studded leather armor is just not something that makes sense from the perspective of designing armor. In-game, it gives you 12 armor class and drops from a lot of early game enemies, so it's going to be your first opportunity to upgrade from 11 to 12 armor class, though again you're going to look to upgrade this as soon as possible, so A tier. Next up, +1 padded armor. So all of these enchanted versions of the generic armors are exactly the same as the generic armor, but with an additional base armor class equal to the number. So padded armor gives you 12 AC rather than the base padded, +1 padded armor gives you 12 AC rather than the base padded armor's 11 AC. They also come with a minor magical effect. In the case of +1 padded armor, you have 1 damage resistance, you take 1 less bludgeoning damage. Now, at the early point in the game, there's actually surprisingly little bludgeoning damage in the game. Most of the goblins and stuff that you'll be facing do piercing or slashing damage, and most of the enemies that are actually going to kill you do piercing or slashing damage, so the resistance to bludgeoning damage actually comes up much less often than you might think. 12 AC with 1 damage resistance to bludgeoning is obviously strictly better than studded leather, but the enchanted armors are available only from traders and only when your party is between certain levels. +1 padded armor is available from levels 2 to 4 from traders that have the random armors trade table, which includes all of the traders in the Grove, so you will be able to buy +1 padded armor relatively early in the game. But by the point that you are level 2 to level 4 and are looking to upgrade your armor, your whole party who is wearing light armor is almost certainly kitted out in studded leather. So is it worth it to upgrade from 12 AC to 12 AC with 1 bludgeoning resistance? Not usually. If you're having trouble finding studded leathers, or you just really want to optimize your party, then it is, of course, technically superior to have +1 padded armor on everyone than to have studded leather on everyone. But for the most part, this is such a minor bonus that it's not something that I would spend any time worrying about getting. I'm going to put it in B tier because it does technically have a use case, which is if you just don't have enough copies of studded leather for your whole party, or if you, in particular, just want to be as absolutely strong as possible at every point in the game, then at level 2 you can upgrade from studded leather to +1 padded, but this isn't something that I would go out of my way to buy under most circumstances. +1 leather armor. This is available from merchants when your party is between levels 4 and level 6, and also gives you 12 AC, just like the +1 padded armor, but instead of 1 bludgeoning resistance, it gives you +1 to your stealth checks. The +1 bonus to stealth checks is obviously a more relevant bonus, but level 4 is a lot higher of a level than level 2, so you're getting the +1 leather armor quite a bit later on in the game. By the time you have access to +1 leather from merchants, your party has to be at least level 4, you probably have better armors already, or are just no longer that interested in this effect. And if you really are going out of your way to get good armors for party members who want this, then you could have the Graceful Cloth by now, depending on the order that you do stuff in. You would have to do a pretty specific order to get that, but it's definitely possible. And obviously the Graceful Cloth blows all of these generic early game light armors out of the water. So you do have to compare these to some of the robes and stuff that are available as well at this point. The +1 leather armor, therefore, I'm going to say is C tier. Again, it is slightly an upgrade to the +1 padded armor, and gold is basically free in Baldur's Gate, especially by the time you're level 4. You should have enough of it that you never really have to worry about gold ever again. So yes, you can technically upgrade from studded leather to +1 leather for the additional stealth check, and that will be a fine thing to do, but these are such marginal bonuses that they're just not things that I think that you should worry about or spend too much time and mental energy on. The Blazer of Benevolence. So this is a quest reward from Act 1, and it gives you 11 base AC, and has, whenever you inspire an ally using Bardic Inspiration, you gain 4 temporary hit points. So this only is better than padded armor, just the non-magical padded armor, if you're a bard, or have access to Bardic Inspiration through some other means, I suppose. And then, even then, only if you're actually using Bardic Inspiration to inspire allies. So if your ally is making a skill check, the temporary hit points don't go away, they're not on a timer, so you can use them before combat starts to have a 4 temporary hit point shield. If you inspire an ally to make a skill check, or if you are inspiring an ally in combat, then you gain 4 temporary hit points. That comes at the cost of at least 1 AC, because by the time you get the Blazer of Benevolence, you definitely have access to studded leather and the +1 padded armor. So you're giving up 1 armor class for 4 temporary hit points, assuming that you're using Bardic Inspiration to inspire an ally. 4 temporary hit points at this stage of the game, where you're like level 3, level 4, is almost certainly worse than an armor class, because the multiplier to your base hit points that 1 point of AC gives you is going to be worth more than 4 temporary hit points that you can't heal and so on, and that require you to spend a resource in a mostly non-optimal way. So the Blazer of Benevolence, even for a bard, even who's making use of it, is worse defensively than just having higher armor class. So even in the optimal circumstance for the Blazer of Benevolence, it's worse at what it does than just the non-magical studded leather. So I wouldn't recommend putting on this item, although I will say it looks pretty cool, so you can definitely make your character look goofy and fancy by putting it on. That's the only conceivable use for this item. The Drow Studded Leather. So the Drow Studded Leather has 12 armor class and gives you Stealth +1. Which sounds like it's identical to the +1 leather armor, which gives you 12 armor class and gives you +1 to stealth checks, but weirdly, the +1 leather armor gives you the stealthy passive that gives you a +1 to your stealth checks, and the Drow Studded Leather gives you stealth +1, and they both have the same armor class. Those sound like they do the same thing, but they actually have a different effect. The stealthy passive gives you +1 on your stealth checks on your character sheet, because it gives you a +1 bonus to your stealth checks, but because they're coded differently, the stealth +1 seems to be coded as an increase to your stealth proficiency. So if you're proficient in stealth, it increases your proficiency by 1. If you're not proficient in stealth, it gives you a 1-point proficiency bonus in stealth, which means that for characters who have expertise, which doubles your stealth proficiency bonus, it actually gives you +2 to your stealth checks, whereas the +1 leather armor for characters with stealth expertise only gives you +1. This is just a weird, narrow corner case, otherwise it's identical to the +1 leather armor, but +2 to your stealth checks is more relevant than +1 to your stealth checks, and the Drow Studded Leather comes out of a box rather than being something that you have to buy from a merchant, so it's going to be an upgrade to studded leather at the point where you get it. +2 to your stealth checks is a not insignificant bonus in the early game, and so this will actually be a meaningful improvement over the studded leather that your character probably has equipped at this point. I'm going to put it in A tier because it's still, again, something that you would rather not be, like, it's not something that you're excited about, but it is a totally reasonable suit of armor to have at this point in the game. The Spidersilk Armour. So you might think this requires specific story choices to get, but actually no matter what story choice you take in Act 1, you're always going to end up with this one way or the other. And this gives you 12 armor class, a +1 bonus to your stealth checks, using the leather armor rules, not the Drow studded leather rules, so this is always +1, never worth +2, even if you have stealth expertise, and advantage on constitution saving throws. 12 armor class and advantage on constitution saving throws is really quite good for casters, and that is who is going to get the most use out of the Spidersilk Armour. The Drow studded leather is better for rogues who probably have stealth expertise, and don't particularly need advantage on constitution saves, but for a caster like a warlock or a bard who has light armor proficiency and will often be concentrating on spells and need to maintain concentration on those spells, the Spidersilk Armour can be very good. So for a defensively minded caster, the Spidersilk Armour, there will be various points in the game where the Spidersilk Armour's advantage on con saves, which includes, of course, concentration saves made from taking damage, will be best in slot for defensively minded casters. So while this isn't very good for the characters, isn't amazing for the characters that I think it was probably intended to be used for, i.e. rogues, this is actually very good for a different kind of character, light armor casters, and for them is S tier. The +2 padded armor. So this is a linear progression over the +1 padded armor, which the +1 armor appears in merchants from levels 2 to 4. The +2 armor appears at merchant inventories from level 5 to 8. So you can buy it starting at level 5, still available comfortably within Act 1. It gives you 13 base AC and 2 bludgeoning damage resistance, so it's an increase of 1 armor class and 1 bludgeoning damage resistance over the +1 padded armor. This might sound like a pretty good deal, because it's your first access to 13 armor class light armor, so it will allow you to upgrade any characters who are wearing 12 armor class light armor up to 13 AC. But 13 AC will probably sound familiar to you, because that's the same base AC that mage armor gives you. That means that by the time you're level 5, most parties are going to be able to have access to mage armor if they have a character that can cast it, or just use scrolls of mage armor or whatever. So for a lot of parties, you will be better off wearing one of the clothing sets with actually good abilities and casting mage armor on that character, rather than settling for the very mediocre 2 bludgeoning damage resistance that the +2 padded armor gives you. This is useful for parties that don't have mage armor access, want to save their spell slots, although that'll be less of a concern starting at, since you have to be level 5 to be able to get the +2 padded armor, or really want to use one of the boots, helmets, or gloves that count as armor, so those will prevent you from using mage armor on that character. So there are real use cases for the +2 padded armor, but a lot of characters are just going to be better off wearing a clothing set, most notably the Graceful Cloth, and then casting mage armor on themselves in order to still get 13, or in the case of the Graceful Cloth, 14 base AC, because that also increases your dexterity. For that reason, I'm going to place the +2 padded armor in B tier, because it does have use cases, but they're relatively narrow, and what you get from it you can duplicate better using a very commonly available resource in the game. So B tier armor. The +1 studded leather. So the +1 studded leather also has 13 base AC, and 1 bludgeoning damage resistance, and appears in merchant shops from level 6 to level 8. So it's identical to the +2 padded in terms of armor class, gives you 1 less bludgeoning damage resistance, and shows up 1 level later. There's no reason you would ever want to use the +1 studded leather, because any circumstance in which you would want this, the +2 padded is just strictly superior, and they're always going to be available at the same time, because the +2 padded armor shows up 1 level earlier, so you're never going to get +1 studded before you get +2 padded, just use the padded armor instead. I will say also, I don't know why the studded leather, they went with bludgeoning damage resistance. as well as the padded armor. Maybe this could have a different niche if it gave you like slashing or piercing damage resistance, and then the leather armor could give you the stealth bonus that it already gives you. That would be a way to differentiate these. As is, this is just a worse version of the +2 padded, which is just a weird thing to have in the game, but D tier armor. The +2 leather. So this is available for merchants starting at level 7, which means for almost every playthrough this is going to be an Act 2 armor. You technically can reach level 7 during Act 1, but most players aren't going to, so this is going to be an armor that you first get access to in Act 2. It gives you 13 base armor class, so again, exactly the same as +1 studded or +2 padded in terms of armor class. Gives you a +1 bonus to stealth checks, and a +1 bonus to your dexterity saves, and dexterity ability checks. The +1 to dex checks plus the +1 to stealth checks combines, of course, to make a +2 bonus to stealth checks for the +2 leather armor. So altogether, this gives you 13 armor class, +2 to stealth checks, and +1 to every other ability, to every other dex ability check, and dexterity saving throws. Now again, what else gives you +1 to all of your dex checks and dex saving throws? Yep, you guessed it, it's the Graceful Cloth, which again can have 13 base AC or 14 base AC because it's increasing your dexterity, if combined with mage armor. So the +2 leather armor, just like the +2 padded armor, just like the +1 studded leather armor, is not going to be better than the Graceful Cloth combined with mage armor, and is going to be significantly worse than the Graceful Cloth combined with mage armor. However, for characters that need to wear light armor or cannot use mage armor, this is a way to get +2 to your stealth checks while still having 13 armor class. So it is an upgrade over the Drow studded leather, and for that reason, it does have a niche for characters that don't have access to or cannot use mage armor, want light armor, and want a stealth check, a boost to their stealth rolls. For that reason, rather than D tier, I'm going to put it in C tier, but the +2 leather armor is just not one that you're most of the time going to end up using. The Penumbral Armour, which I've had to restart this section several times because I keep stumbling over the word penumbral. The Penumbral Armour is a 12 armor class armor available in Act 2 that gives you a +3 bonus to your stealth checks while you're obscured. Obscured is when you're in an unlit area, so anywhere where there's no lighting effect, ambient light, or anytime you're inside something that obscures you, like a fog cloud or darkness spell, you'll get a +3 bonus to your stealth checks. +3 to stealth checks is a pretty significant bonus to your stealth checks, and so this armor could potentially be pretty useful for like a stealth archer, especially if you're doing the greater invisibility thing where you have to make a lot of stealth checks of increasing difficulties. That +3 bonus could be very useful. However, those builds, as I've said many times this tier list, again are most likely to be using the Graceful Cloth at this point, which does the same thing but better. 12 armor class is also a pretty significant penalty compared to the higher armor class versions of light armor that you have access to at this point, or compared to using a normal clothing set combined with mage armor. So the Penumbral Armour has a niche for stealth archery that's filled better by other armor sets, and therefore is just not going to see a ton of play as a result. If you're doing like a double stealth archer playthrough, where one of them is using the Graceful Cloth and one of them is using the Penumbral Armour, this could have a niche. Or if you're doing like a lot of stealth checks with your entire party. So I'm going to put this in C tier because it does have, in like an all stealth party or something where multiple characters are making a lot of stealth checks, or for a party that doesn't have access to the Graceful Cloth, for whatever reason, the Penumbral Armour can be useful, but it is, again, mostly beaten out by a clothing option combined with mage armor, or just by higher AC armors if what you want is better armor class. The Shadeclinger Armour. Shadeclinger Armour is available from a merchant in Act 2 and gives you 12 base armor class. While obscured, so when you're in an unlit area, inside a fog cloud or a darkness spell, you have advantage on saving throws, and it gives you +1 to your stealth checks. Actually, it gives you stealth +1, it uses the same rules as the Drow studded leather, so for characters with stealth expertise, it's actually stealth +2, for everybody else it's +1 stealth. The big thing here is advantage on saving throws while you're obscured. Obscured isn't that difficult to achieve in most combats, especially if you set up the combats in advance, and especially because this shows up in Act 2, which is just very dark, so a lot of the time your party is going to be obscured whether you want them to be or not, and you'll have advantage on on saving throws as a result. Saving throw advantage is a pretty powerful ability, though again it's a purely defensive ability, which are just less powerful overall than offensive abilities. And the +2 to stealth checks isn't amazing, but is relevant to some characters who want, maybe you're some kind of stealth caster, like an arcane trickster rogue, so you want to maintain concentration on spells, and also make stealth checks. The Shadeclinger Armour could be useful. The problem here is just the base 12 AC, which is very low. So even though this gives you advantage on saving throws, and it's all saving throws, not just concentration, but advantage on saves is most useful for characters that are concentrating on stuff. Even though it gives you advantage on those concentration saves, you're just going to get hit more often when you're wearing this armor, because it only has 12 base armor class, so you've reduced your armor class to get that advantage, which means you're just going to have to make more concentration checks than if you were wearing a different armor. For that reason, it doesn't do that well at protecting your concentration, because the armor class just isn't very high. This is useful for a character that is not worried about physical damage and just wants to have advantage on saves. This is one of the on saving throws. This is one of the early ways to get that semi-reliably, to get advantage on saves against spells, against fear, and so on. So if you're a character like an Abjuration Wizard, or something along those lines that's just not worried about physical damage, and you're going into a fight where the enemy might disable your character with Hold Person or something, the Shadeclinger Armour can be useful. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier, because you might swap this in for some specific encounters, and it's a powerful enough effect that it's worth considering. Though, again, if you forget this armor exists, it honestly will not hurt you that much. Alright, that was all of the Act 2 armors, so now we're on to Act 3 armors. And honestly, it's been kind of slim pickings up to this point, so hopefully the Act 3 light armors can come through and save light armor as a category for us. I have to say we're not off to a promising start with the Scarlet Leather Armor, which is just a version of the +1 leather armor that's unique to Act 3. So this is an Act 1 armor that you get in Act 3. It gives you 12 base armor class and a +1 bonus to your stealth checks. Obviously, that wasn't a great armor in Act 1. In Act 3, that's a terrible armor, so D tier. Things are getting a little bit better, though, with the +2 studded leather. This is another one that's available for merchants or random item drops, starting at level 9. Gives you 14 base armor class, 1 bludgeoning damage resistance, and +1 to your initiative rolls. So this is probably our first 14 AC light armor, so it's the first time that light armor is actually better than mage armor. And it also gives us +1 to our initiative. +1 initiative is a very, very powerful ability. Initiative increases are absolutely key in Baldur's Gate, because not only is initiative one of the best stats in Dungeons & Dragons in general, in Baldur's Gate 3 it's rolled on a d4 instead of a d20, so even small bonuses to your initiative are correspondingly way more valuable than they are in the tabletop game. So a 14 AC armor that gives you +1 to your initiative is just a very solid item. At this point, you are in Act 3, almost certainly, because you're level 9, maybe like the very end of Act 2, but you're heading towards Act 3, but there will be a big chunk of time before you get access to the very endgame armors, where the +2 studded leather is going to be an excellent armor choice for your rogues, and other light armor users, giving you decent AC and a very relevant initiative bonus, so we're going to place it in S tier. This is the first armor that we're actually, actively happy to get, of pretty much all of these armors, so it's good that it shows up from merchants, and every party will be able to access it. Next up, the Armour of Landfall. So this is the first of the 3 druid armors, or druid-themed armors. Each of these 3 armors are themed after one of the 3 druid subclasses, and obviously the Armour of Landfall is themed for land druids. I will say it's a bit of an odd choice that they made these light armors, because druids are medium armor users, they have medium armor proficiency, so why are the special druid armors light armors rather than being medium armors? But that's what they are. That actually opens up some interesting use cases for other characters, though, for the Armour of Landfall, which has no abilities that actually require you to be a druid or a land druid in particular in order to use. The Armour of Landfall gives you 13 base armor class, +1 to your save DCs, and advantage on constitution saves, which includes, of course, concentration saves, which means that's just a pretty solid package for any spellcaster. So if you're a wizard or sorcerer who happens to be like a human or half-elf, which of course Gale is, then you will have access to the Armour of Landfall, and it's going to be a pretty solid piece of armor for you. +1 to save DCs and advantage on con saves is good, but it also gives you some more abilities in addition to that. It also lets you cast Plant Growth once per short rest, and heals you when you start your turn on a Plant Growth surface. The healing isn't that relevant, though you can use it for a little bit of out-of-combat healing, but Plant Growth is a very powerful level 3 spell, just a very good spell overall, really good for crowd control-focused parties, and being able to cast it once per short rest is awesome. It's going to save you a lot of spell slots, so very good for like a Warlock to combine with Hunger of Hadar, stuff like that. Very good to combine with any other AoE damage spell, cloud kills, etc. So Plant Growth is just a very powerful spell to have access to. +1 to your save DCs is a solid ability for spellcasters. Advantage on con saves is also a solid ability for spellcasters. The main thing holding this armor back is the 13 base AC, which again is exactly the same as a set of clothing plus mage armor, but a lot of the available clothing sets at this point have increases to their armor class. So if you're wearing like the Robe of the Weave, plus using mage armor, you have 15 armor class, whereas the Armour of Landfall only gives you 13. So you're going to be relatively low AC if you're using this armor. For that reason, I think that it is not quite as good as it looks, and a lot of times your land druids are going to be better off in more defensively minded medium armor sets, and your other spellcasters are going to be better off in robes plus using mage armor. So this armor actually struggles to find a niche. It's still a very solid armor with a lot of great abilities wrapped into a single package, but like a lot of the light armors, it's just held back by relatively low base AC, which makes it a little bit risky to actually use. I'm going to put it in A tier because it's still a very good armor, but a lot of the time you're just going to be better off with another option. The Armour of Moonbasking. As you can tell from the name, this is the druid armor designed for Circle of the Moon druid, and this has 11 base AC as compared to the Armour of Landfall's 13, but also gives you +2 AC as an enchantment, so it still gives you 13 base AC. That +2 AC also persists during your wild shape forms, so you have an increase of 2 armor class in wild shape on all of your wild shape forms, and advantage on saving throws against spells, which also persists into wild shape form. When you activate wild shape while wearing this armor, you also get 22 temporary hit points, and while you have those temporary hit points, you reduce all incoming damage by 1. So basically this boosts all your wild shapes armor class by 2, gives you advantage on saving throws against spells permanently, whether you're in wild shape or not, and gives you 22 hit points and 1 damage reduction whenever you enter wild shape. So that vastly increases the effectiveness of the durability of your wild shape forms, which in the late game is starting to fall off. By the time you reach the Armour of Moonbasking in Act 3, your wild shape forms are relatively squishy at this point, so something that increases their longevity is going to be incredibly powerful. Obviously, this is intended for a wild shaping druid and only works with wild shape, but both moon druids and land druids can benefit from the Armour of Moonbasking if you're a land druid that uses wild shape relatively often, which a lot of land druids will, since it's still a very powerful effect. These temporary hit points that you get, also, there is a sort of cheese with them, because this effect triggers whenever you enter wild shape. So if you've lost those 22 temporary hit points, or even lost a few of them, if you talk to a party member while wild shaped, it puts you back into humanoid form for the conversation, and then puts you back into wild shape form at the end of the conversation without spending a wild shape charge, and you refresh the temporary hit points. So you can cheese the temporary hit points to just always have +22. Overall, this is just a very powerful set of abilities for any character that's going to be wild shaping. So for a moon druid or a land druid that intends to wild shape frequently, this is obviously the best in slot armor. It's one of the very few armors in the game that actually, or items in the game in general, that actually works with wild shape at all, and that's what moon druids are looking for, is items that work while they're wild shaped. This item is perfect for them, slots right into exactly what you're trying to do. S tier item. The Armour of the Sporekeeper. This is the one themed around Spore Druids, of course, and the Armour of the Sporekeeper gives you 13 base armor class, +1 to your save DCs, which obviously is very relevant for any spellcaster, not just Spore Druids, but very good for Spore Druids as well, and +1 to your necrotic damage. This +1 necrotic damage is a damage rider, so it adds on to any necrotic damage you do. So on Tactician mode or below, if you're doing multiple instances of necrotic damage with the same attack, like let's say you're an Ascended Astarian Monk using the necrotic version of your open hand monk powers, you're going to get +1 necrotic damage for each instance of necrotic damage you do. On Honor mode, that will still happen sometimes, though less so, because on Honor mode they cleaned up some of that damage rider stuff. But this can often be like 4 or 5 extra necrotic damage per attack if you have deliberately stacked damage rider effects on Tactician mode or below. So for players who are interested in maximizing damage, the Armour of the Sporekeeper can actually do a whole bunch of additional damage. There's also some effects that trigger off of that 1 necrotic damage, so you can really multiply your damage geometrically using the Armour of the Sporekeeper, which is a bug, but definitely worth noting. The Armour of the Sporekeeper also gives you the Spore Sacs abilities, which when you activate Symbiotic Entity, the ability of the Spore Druid that gives you temporary hit points, so this obviously only works for Spore Druids, you gain 3 new abilities in addition to the abilities that normally gives you. These abilities are each usable once per long rest. They used to refresh when you recast Symbiotic Entity or when you equipped and unequipped the armor. That's no longer true, so they're usable once per long rest. And they include Bibberbang Spores, which deal poison damage in an AoE, Timisk Spores, which deal poison damage in an AoE and have a chance of confusing enemies, which is very powerful, of course, because this is just a pretty powerful disable. And Haste Spores, which is the same as the Haste Spores grenade, which creates a cloud where when you enter it, you get hasted for 1 turn. So this is effectively an AoE haste for your entire party. Notably, the Haste Spores action is a bonus action. So once per day bonus action AoE haste for your entire party is still just very, very powerful, even though this is no longer as exploitative as it used to be. AoE haste is incredibly strong and definitely worth casting for just about any party. There's 2 ways to use this armor. You can either just wear it as your normal armor, and you gain quite a few benefits from it. You get decent armor class with the 13 AC, +1 to save DC, +1 to all your necrotic damage, which you're doing a bunch of as a Spore Druid, and actually the Haste Spores ability once per day is just very powerful. Or you can swap it in, use the Haste Spores, and then swap it out for another long rest for a different armor, until you've long rested so you can refresh the Haste Spores. Either way, Haste Spores is just such an incredibly powerful ability. Bonus action AoE haste for your whole party is just ridiculously strong that the Armour of the Sporekeeper still goes in S tier, even though they've fixed a bunch of the exploits and bugs with this item. And the other abilities are no slouch for Spore Druids or other casters either, so there's a bunch of niche builds that can really use this item, especially on lower difficulty settings, but on Honor mode, whether you're swapping this in and out to gain the benefits of the Haste Spores once per day, or whether you are just using it as your main armor, the Armour of the Sporekeeper is excellent, S tier armor. The Bhaalist Armour. So the Bhaalist Armour is locked behind a specific story event, and so only some parties are going to get access to the Bhaalist Armour, but it's a very powerful item. It gives you 14 armor class and +2 to your initiative, so already it's better than the +2 studded leather, being the same armor class and giving you a +2 to your initiative instead of +1, which is very good all by itself. That already is awesome, but of course the hits don't stop there because the Bhaalist Armour gives you the Aura of Murder ability. Passively, Enemies within 7 feet of the wearer of the Bhaalist Armour become vulnerable to piercing damage. The tooltip says unless they are resistant or immune to piercing damage, but actually that's not true. They still gain the vulnerability if they're resistant to piercing damage. So the Aura of Murder ability just gives everything within 7 feet of you vulnerability to piercing. Vulnerability doubles any damage they take from that damage type, which in Dungeons & Dragons is a very rarely given ability because it just ruins combat balance. An enemy that was supposed to take 4 turns to defeat so it could use all of its cool abilities now only takes 2 turns to defeat when it's taking double damage from every source. An enemy that was supposed to take 2 turns only takes 1 turn and no longer gets to cast any of its spells at all. That's a pretty common thing to have happen when you have the Bhaalist Armour in your party. Obviously, this armor was intended for dagger characters, because it boosts piercing damage, and they are very, very powerful with it, but actually a lot of different parties can gain a ton of value from the Bhaalist Armour. Firstly, archers also do piercing damage, so there are 2 ways to benefit massively from the Bhaalist Armour for archers. Actually, 3 ways. One is to just have another party member wear it, move them next to the target that you want to shoot, and then shoot them. They will take double damage because this is a vulnerability aura. It doesn't have to be the character who's actually wearing the Bhaalist Armour who's doing the piercing damage in order to get double damage out of it. 2 is to use Crossbow Expert, the feat, and move into melee and then just attack with hand crossbows, or with, I guess, a heavy crossbow, to do piercing damage just in melee happily while using the Bhaalist Armour. But 3, and this is a little bit weird, the Bhaalist Armour's aura is a 7-foot aura, and that's meaningful because the threatened radius in game is 5 feet. So the aura extends just a little bit further than melee range. So there's a 2-foot radius around every enemy, or a 2-foot span around every enemy, where you can shoot without being in melee. So archers can still just use the Bhaalist Armour. It requires careful positioning. Honestly, I wish this was just a 5-foot aura, because it's so irritating to use that, even though it's optimal to, like, position your character perfectly to get them in the aura but not in melee, is just a bunch of finicky positioning work that you have to do to maximize this armor. But, of course, that's an incredibly powerful strategy. Any character that's doing piercing damage regularly, whether that be through daggers or archery, is going to benefit massively from the Bhaalist Armour, either to wear themselves or have a party member wear. And also, just most parties have a bunch of piercing damage randomly in the party. Some spells do piercing damage, some effects do piercing damage. This only affects enemies, it only affects hostile creatures, so it's not going to make your party members weak to piercing damage. The amount of bonus damage you're getting from this, even if you're not optimizing to use it, is absurd. And of course, if you're optimizing to use it, this just breaks the game absolutely in half. It would be ridiculous not to put the Bhaalist Armour in S tier. In fact, it is probably an S plus tier armor because vulnerability, just especially like free passive vulnerability, just isn't something that the player should ever get access to. So getting it for free on an armor that you just have to walk near an enemy to use kind of breaks the game balance. Though, of course, you get this late enough into Act 3 that your party has already broken game balance already. Bhaalist Armour is S tier. And finally, the elegant studded leather. I will say that it's a little bit lazy that all of the Act 3 armors are just recolors of the same 2 textures, but what can you do? The elegant studded leather gives you 14 base armor class, plus 2 to your initiative, advantage on stealth checks, and the ability to cast the shield spell once per short rest. From a mechanical standpoint, the elegant studded leather is maybe my favorite armor design in the game. It is elegant. It's just a very elegant armor design. It's the first light armor that actually does a good job at keeping you alive, because 14 AC and plus 2 initiative is great. Advantage on stealth checks, it works very well with the theme of the characters, and the shield spell once per short rest can let you like bait attacks with your rogue and then block them with the shield spell. So it's just very good at keeping your characters alive. Also an excellent armor for spellcasters or unarmored characters, for spellcasters who have light armor access, like bards, warlocks, or human wizards and sorcerers, because the plus 2 initiative is very relevant for them, and the shield spell and decent AC can keep those characters alive as well. This is weaker overall than the Bhaalist Armour, especially for parties that can use the Bhaalist Armour or characters that are intended to do mostly piercing damage, but still very powerful, and the shield spell once per short rest is actually very good at keeping your character alive. Also, the Elegant Studded Leather is not locked behind story events, so it is going to be accessible to most parties, whereas the Bhaalist Armour is only going to be accessible to some. For that reason, the Elegant Studded Leather is an S-tier armor, just an excellent armor set. It is always good. I think it is a rare party that isn't going to have this featured somewhere in the party at some point in the playthrough, just because of how solid the abilities are and how well they all work together. And of course, if you're doing specifically stealth archery or something like that, the Elegant Studded Leather is going to be great because of the advantage on stealth checks. But just having good base armor class, plus 2-tier initiative, and the ability to keep your character alive if something goes wrong, all wrapped up in a single package, makes the Elegant Studded Leather elegant and excellent. S tier. So let's talk about light armor as a whole. I'll be honest, when I sat down to do this tier list and having now finished it, the thing that really stands out to me about light armor and what surprises me about light armors in general is just how bad they are. The first exciting light armors show up in Act 3, and up to that point there are just not that many of them, and a lot of them are variations on just linear increases in armor class from 11 to 13, which is relatively low and outdone by basic spell access. And so most characters from in Act 1 and 2, you know, the majority of the game and also the hardest parts of the game, just don't have great options for light armor. I think I sort of intuitively understood this because so many builds are going to end up using the Graceful Cloth plus Mage Armor, are going to end up using robes, or are going to end up using one of the uncapped medium armors, one of the medium armors like the Yuan-Ti Scale or whatever that doesn't cap your dexterity bonus to armor class, rather than actually using light armors. And the reason for that is that there just aren't that many good options. In Act 3, things obviously get way better when you get some really exciting options, like the 2 Druid armors mentioned here for Druids, the Bhaalist Armour, and the Elegant Studded Leather for Rogues and Spellcasters. But up to that point, pickings are quite slim, and a lot of characters are going to have to look elsewhere for their armor options, which is why you'll so frequently want to dip another class when you're playing a rogue, so you get medium armor access, or one amongst the reasons why you would want to dip another class when playing a rogue, because medium armor access helps them out so much. Often when I sit down to do one of these tier lists, I come away from it going, oh, there's like some hidden gems that I had sort of forgotten about or not noticed, but the opposite is true with light armor. I feel like I came away having less respect for light armors than I went into this tier list with, because of just how weak they are for the first 2/3 of the game. Nevertheless, there's still some really solid options, and of course in Act 3 you get some really, really good ones. And of course, if you think that I have misplaced any of these, do let me know in the comments. As always, I'm very open to moving things around. If you have a good reason why you think something should be in a different tier, then definitely do let me know, and I will absolutely consider moving it around and correcting that in future installments. As always, of course, I hope that you enjoyed the tier list, and if you did enjoy the video, please feel free to leave a comment and hit the like button. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I do appreciate people taking the time to do that. Really does mean a lot. Helps keep the Baldur's Gate scene alive. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate videos and other strategy game content. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.